Hi everyone, this is going to be a heavily theory-based video, so don't take any claims I make about my opinions as gospel. I prefer to think of it as me adding to the scientific literature, uh, as we have an ever-increasing wealth of knowledge on the neurobiological side, but I won't be diving into that too heavily. I have my own feelings about the approach and the points, and I'll try to keep it simple. Um, and I'll also have a transcript and sources linked in the description, as well as any relevant links. So, with that out of the way, I could kick this off by expanding on how we experience these things, citing clinical research and neurobiology, but for me, there is a philosophical issue right off the bat. I believe Thomas H. Fitzgerald from General Motors, oddly enough, explains this very well, based on his findings on motivation research. He just believes it doesn't work. When transported from the laboratory, the language of motivation may become subtly elitist by suggesting that the employee resembles a captive rodent in a training box equipped with levers, trick doors, food pellets, and electric grids. I find that relevant, very relevant, because academia looks at motivation as this very morally neutral yet fascinating neurological phenomenon. Yet the biggest application of this information is fueling a $1.9 billion industry of selling motivation to its companies and their sad employees. So I could make an analogy about how animal ethnography is played out in comparison to how employee management can also be described as ethnography with the express purpose of getting work accomplished, but the language is also reflected in how human studies are written about. If there is no zookeeper to motivate the unpredictable behavior of the animals, then it is up to us to be our own zookeepers and treat our brains as finicky animals that need to be tricked into piloting our bodies into doing what we want. This line of reasoning is pretty disembodied and actually lines up very well with a functionalist view of the mind. Um, Published in Stanford's Encyclopedia of Psychology, functionalism is the philosophy of mind that states that what makes something a mental state doesn't necessarily depend on how it's made, but rather on how it functions. So you can think of the brain as a black box in this way that receives inputs from the outside and then gives them back to the outside. And what happens to the body, what happens to the box is not relevant enough to delve into. But for short term solutions, it's most important to learn how to manipulate it and predict an optimal state of being in order to function. And even in layman's terms, depression is often described like this, citing it's like my body is working against my mind. The brain is like an inconsistent vending machine that you have to stub your toe on, kicking so much because it jams at the worst moments. And the intricacies of the machine are so unimportant and mysterious that the focus is about trying to whip the brain into shape, like an employee falling behind on an urgent deadline. And in my opinion, looking at our brains is just this computer to our bodies, sort of sci fi style brain floating in a tube. It's kind of a lonely way to look at yourself. I don't subscribe to that form of thinking. I think, in my opinion, it's more realistic to say that we're not simply computing the world, but we're in it as the captain and the ship, sort of computing and experiencing at the same time in a very synergistic loop. To me, cognition and thinking doesn't end at the base of the skull, implying that the brain is, severed from the body, because that's ridiculous. That would be making an arbitrary cross section of the spinal cord like the end, and that seems unfair without contextualizing the global scheme of things. Besides, embodied cognition and embedded cognition are theories that are gaining credence as more of the scientific literature these days are working to erode the boundaries and challenge the Western notion of cognition. And this quote in particular is what I want to argue when it comes to motivation. It's the proposal that cognition is supported by a nested structure of task specific synergies which are softly assembled from a variety of neural, bodily, and environmental components, including other individuals, and exhibit interaction dominant dynamics. Scientific labeling of environmental components is something that is a process and a relation, so I can't expect to have a single answer when it comes to this. but it is definitely one of the more exciting pursuits in cognitive science at the moment, and it's something that I think of personally as looking externally versus looking internally. And this is all just to say, I believe the bioessentialization of motivation and depression misses the point of us observing these phenomena. Not to drag neurobiology back into this, but I believe that the existence of our amygdalas as primitive, enduring structures in our brains seeking danger and holding on to anxiety and fear as an evolutionary survival tactic is sort of a living proof that we have the architecture to withstand suffering, not necessarily foster happiness. There is no analogous structure that I can easily argue besides the parasympathetic nervous system, which is more so vague and embodied. So it's not a hot take for me to say that being happy and well adjusted is like this goal that we don't have, like we have to learn to pursue. But the solid truth is that we will always be 3 days without water away from dying. And our facade as a first world country, fear in the US, is crumbling as the years tick on. And to try to write this fragility and fear out of our examinations of the brain, to pander to the obsessive need for science to stay bias free, is ignoring the planet we live on in order to appeal to some elementary school level notion that science is cold and unfeeling. Really, truly, the one thing I hate about academia and cognitive science is that the illusion of objectivity only comes with stripping away all emotion when you're trying to make a point. But when we're talking about drive and motivation, it's a very emotional process, whether you're aware of it or not. It's extremely hard for me to take people seriously when they try to cosplay as cold, unfeeling robots whose only goal in life is to pad their CV, sound right, and just get by in this shithole world. It's obviously so fake. So if that was all rambling to you, I will now be bringing in more studies, more cold hard facts for people who may have ignored my comment about the ivory tower and objectivity obsession, etc. What I'd like to argue is that loneliness, together with depression symptoms, work to diametrically oppose affect and motivation conceptually. In a visual like this, we can view the depression spiral as being perpetually affected by internal reactions to external circumstances. And in this example, the behaviors that further the vortex are all isolating in nature, which makes sense. Viewing the neurobiology of depression in isolation, however, might miss the big picture. Because if the bounds of embedded cognition extend to other individuals, or can be theorized to do so, then it should be reasonable to assume that social groups can become parameters of study. But if you flip that, that means isolation can become a potential confound, and behavioral studies typically don't account for that when it comes to humans, though there are now more than enough rat studies, funnily enough, that are really questioning this model of looking into individual motivation. A rat study published in 2021 found that rats in isolation increase food and nicotine seeking behaviors during abstinence from the social group, but that social housing can reverse these effects. And the reason why I picked this study in particular is because it reminds me of one of the more famous series of rat studies ever done concerning the use of motivation and drug use, and it's called Rat Park. Rat Park was a series of studies into drug addiction theory conducted in the late 1970s by a group of psychologists at Simon Fraser University. The head psychologist, Bruce K. Alexander, hypothesized that raising rats in isolation might be responsible for a higher than expected drug self-administration. So, in order to model a rat society, they built what could be considered a rat paradise, which in their mind was a spacious colony that had all the things a rat could desire and need, but more importantly, probably, or the abundance of companions that could be found in the park. For the first experiment, the rats were either put into isolation or in the park, and both were offered a choice of plain water and bitter, drug laced morphine water, essentially. And for the most part, neither of the groups particularly enjoyed it. They didn't control for their tastes in this part of the experiment. So as the days went on, all the rats avoided the extremely bitter morphine sugar solution, but the scientists ended up lowering the morphine in order to get a handle on what their tastes would accommodate. And after the 2 week mark, both of the groups' consumption of the drugs rose, but the ones in the park were ingesting it at a fraction of the rate of the isolated rats at this point. In a side experiment, the scientists tested the addictive nature of opiates from the opposite direction of trying to get them hooked, which was by having the rats already be physically dependent. And on choice days, they would analyze whether or not the rats would go for plain water or drugged water in both groups. And what they found was that the isolated rats actually increased their intake on choice days, while on the flip side, the rats in the park managed to power through their withdrawal symptoms in the attempt of trying to have their social lives stay uninterrupted. And I guess the biggest takeaway from that is that the isolated rats are not afforded this opportunity. So, one of the three main theories that were supported as a result of these studies is that the rats did have to be tricked slash bribed into taking these drugs, and sugar and isolation were required to make them want it. And the second was that given the chance to socialize correctly, and above minimum requirements, the rats didn't really have an appetite for drugs. And the third most important probably is that chemical addiction was not the strongest factor when it came to influencing their behavior. Well, I could probably make a separate, longer video about the implications of the study. The finding that continues to stick with me is the fact that the rats, when they had the choice for a drug induced high in their social life, were able to power through their withdrawal symptoms in order to keep their lives intact with the other residents. And it's obviously so easy to overgeneralize the findings of this study in particular, but that's why I find the 2021 study to be very almost like prophetic in how it drew inspiration from this series of studies. And I can only hope that since isolation in these instances were able to be so causally related to a state of hopelessness and a need to escape, then the solution can probably be sought out in community, right? So, to try and conclude my point, I'm going to share my favorite study that demonstrates this idea of looking outward for solutions as opposed to looking inward. This study was published in the CNS and Neurological Disorders Journal in 2013. It's called Social Support and the Perception of General Slant. In 2 studies, they tested basically whether or not a psychosocial resource can also affect the visual perception of slants. And participants accompanied by a friend estimated a hill to be less steep when compared to participants who were alone. Study 1. In similar news, participants who thought of a support friend during an imagery task saw a hill as less steep than participants who either thought of a neutral person or a disliked person. And in both studies, the effects of social relationships on visual perception appear to be mediated by relationship quality. So artifacts such as mood, social desirability, and social facilitation did not account for these effects. And this research demonstrates that an interpersonal phenomenon, social support, can influence visual perception. And I feel not for me to make this all poetic and stuff, but there is a very simple metaphor of steepness and difficulty with achieving obstacles that can come to mind when it comes to extrapolating from this study. To me, that adds evidence to the idea of social relationships helping us get out of our own heads when it comes to perceiving difficulty of the obstacles in our life. So it almost feels like we have all the answers when it comes to how to best, you know, stay motivated. It's just that our priorities are a little depressing right now, and mental health is highly individual and individualized. And honestly, the hardest thing to do right now is keep fostering that community that is so necessary for our growth and leaning on each other when we individually face those inconceivably steep hills. I truly believe that we'll be able to find a more applicable answer when it comes to hacking motivation and depression by quite literally and clinically getting outside of our own minds. And I think we're insightful enough to realize that the things that create loneliness are mostly structural by nature. But that doesn't mean we should give up, because that's depression, the pessimist, trying to win. So, really, it is up to us at this point to remember that our obstacles can metaphorically seem smaller when you have other people in your circle and your corner. And hopefully that's motivational to you. Thank you.